The next question is, when after President Nixon got elected, he, in early 1969, he forms the Urban Affairs Council, and he taps Daniel Patrick Moynihan to lead it.
Correct.
This is kind of a three-part question.
Okay.
What was the Urban Affairs Council?
Okay.
Who was Daniel Patrick Moynihan? Why did he choose him? And how did you come to join?
Okay.
The
The Urban Affairs Council was a new entity, Nixon needed a Democrat in the administration. He had barely won the election. The Congress, both houses of Congress, were going to be controlled by the Democrats. He had made several offers to get Democrats in the cabinet, notably Henry Scoop Jackson, the state of Washington senator, for Secretary of Defense, which he didn't do. And strangely, for odd reasons, he approached Pat Moynihan, professor at Harvard, much influenced in the selection by Bob Finch, by Lynn Garment, by Ray Price, all of whom were fans of Moynihan. So Garment was delegated to go and to have dinner with Nixon and with Moynihan and find out whether he was interested in joining the administration and if he was interested in what position. I should say, by the way, I was a good friend of Moynihan's, but I had never suggested him to Nixon or said to Moynihan, what a good idea. I had sent him a copy of the Mazo Hess book with an inscription something like, in case you want to change your mind, but it was just a joke. So Garment says, what would you take? And Nixon says, transportation. And Garment says, we can't give you transportation. It's already promised to John Volpe, the governor of Massachusetts. What else? And Moynihan says, well, in that case, I'd like something in the White House comparable to the National Security Council that Henry Kissinger has. I should say, by the way, Henry Kissinger was a colleague of Moynihan's at Harvard. And I really think that is the genesis. There are other strands, but in a sense, that's what Moynihan asked for. He wanted Moynihan. Why not give it to him? And so when he announced the appointment of Moynihan from the Hotel Pierre in New York, he mentioned that he was creating the Urban Affairs Council, which would be comparable to the National Security Council. In fact, it was never comparable to the National Security Council, nor could it have been. The structures domestically and in foreign policy are really too dissimilar.
What was the difference between what was later created under John Ehrlichman, the Domestic Council, and the Urban Affairs Council?
Yeah, really very little. In other words, the trajectory of Nixon's domestic policies were really established in that first year with Moynihan, and his struggle with Arthur Burns over what came out of it, and some won, some lost, and was announced in a major speech by Nixon on August 8th, 1969. At that point, it was Nixon's wish to reorganize. Neither Burns nor Moynihan were administrators. There was now a policy set. They were the policy proponents. There was a policy. Now it should be turned over to the administrators. That's a perfectly logical thing to do, by the way. Good sense. Moynihan was only going to stay another year and then go back to Harvard, because when you leave Harvard, you're given a 2-year leave of absence unless you want to resign, as Henry Kissinger did. And Burns was being appointed the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which is a job he always wanted. So that cleared the path, and then the internal politicking, produced John Ehrlichman and his staff. But the sense of what they were doing was very much in keeping with where the administration had been as it was winnowed through the Burns Moynihan debate.
What was your role on the Urban Affairs Council as deputy to Moynihan?
Yeah, I had various roles. I had not expected to go back to the White House. Having been in the White House under Eisenhower, I wanted to go into government, but for another type of experience. But Moynihan asked me, and Moynihan felt he needed me. Remember, Moynihan was a Democrat. He didn't know any of these people he was going to be working with. Of course, I knew all of them. So I could be useful to him. Also, he was a dear friend. It was going to be fun working with him. So there was no question that if asked, I would do it. And Nixon was perfectly happy to give me that presidential appointment. But my role on the staff, because after all, I was not an expert in urban policy, was several. Moynihan had a small staff. And as Moynihan's habit, they were off in all directions. My job, in part, was to keep them on the same track, all of them knowing what the others were doing. By the way, it turned out to be a very young group, but a very distinguished group over time. I mean, the kid who was 22 years old, who sat outside my desk, outside my door, was named Richard Blumenthal, is now a United States Senator. Checker Finn, who was almost outside of Pat's door next door, became Assistant Secretary of Education under Reagan. So this was quite an interesting group, and very energetic and off. So one thing I did was the thing that a chief of staff would be expected to do, keep them all in the same loop. Secondly, the thing I did was I was a backup to Moynihan. Moynihan was constantly making commitments that ultimately he couldn't keep. And some of them were quite elaborate. Hey, I've got to go to, I promised to go to Hong Kong. I can't get there. Okay, I'll go to Hong Kong for you. So I was constantly filling in for things that his commitments. And the third thing, if you're a baseball fan, you know the phrase bench coach. I was the person who could advise him on what would be the right move, if indeed he made it. That was actually quite important. Nixon, who called himself a moderate conservative, was in many ways a centrist. And he got there by lurching domestically. One set of decisions would be far right, choosing Supreme Court justices. Another set of decisions would be considered fair left. So he was a centrist by averaging. And it was important, playing that role for Moynihan, to help him know when was a good time to move in relation to this president who didn't, in domestic affairs, unlike foreign affairs, have a fixed policy.
In his memoirs, President Nixon talks about the Family Assistance Plan and how working with Daniel Patrick Moynihan was one of the most important actions he attempted during his administration. Could you touch upon that?
Well, the Family Assistance Plan was basically a negative income tax. It was giving money to poor people without regard to whether they were married or not. The welfare programs at that time, husbands had to leave their wives in order for their wives to get a check. And of all the domestic issues that came up, I think the one that most engaged Nixon was welfare. And the one in which he asks for the most information, the most backup on every point, the most data. And I think when you dig deep enough, it had a lot to do with his own youth. And this ultimately came out in a speech he gave in December 1970 before the White House Conference on Youth, where he talked about his father's little store and how kids would come in and their parents were on welfare and they would give them what they could. But they were never the same because the way people looked down upon them. And I think this was a real issue. It happened, of course, to be a case with Moynihan as well, whose father left him when he was a before he was even probably 8, 10 years old. They shared this, although I don't think they ever talked about it because they were not the sort that would have. But I think this allowed a sensitivity on the president's part that wasn't necessarily there on many other domestic issues. Having said that, there's no doubt that in the conflict with Burns, a very honorable conflict, Moynihan was the better bureaucratic politician. He was funny, he was clever, he knew how to create an agenda to keep the president coming back to meetings. He could help the president wanted a reading list. What should I read? What political biography? He even helped him on his reading list. He had the White House honors program. He gave him a list of what honors he thought he should give. So they got along. They became quite friendly, and this was probably a surprise to both of them. But that's the way it worked out. So Moynihan, in a sense, was winning that contest. That doesn't mean that you get what you want. But initially, I think Moynihan was doing very well in getting what he wanted because the president and the people immediately around him were worried that if he didn't, he would get up and leave. He was the outsider. And so I think particularly early on, the issue came up with a big message for the District of Columbia, which was part of our agenda, but also very important to the Attorney General, John Mitchell. And I think Moynihan got things in that message that he would not otherwise have gotten, whether somehow the president thought, oh boy, I better hold on to this guy. He could up it. And Moynihan, at that point, made it very clear to the president that he wasn't leaving. Remember, Moynihan was a person who had to prove his loyalty. He was not part of the team. And he proved it in a really profound way because he was the outsider. He was the person who was against the Vietnam War and other things, and he never said that. So after a while, I think the president really respected him for his loyalty. And loyalty was very important to Richard Nixon. So that entered into the equation. So after a while, as they became friends, it was almost as if the president was saying, I'll give you what you want as long as it doesn't embarrass me or cost very much. Because Pat had a long list of things, now that he was in the White House, that he wanted the government to do. And some of them were important, but very hidden. For example, Pat, as a social scientist, used the statistical systems of the United States. At that time, they measured people as white and non-white. It was the absence of whiteness that was defined other people. And he wrote the president, he said, this is awful. This is outrageous to call people non-white. And the president said, yeah, sure, do something about it. So Moynihan calls in all of the people that use statistical systems, Bureau of the Budget, Labor, Commerce, and he said, okay, let's work on this. And they did, and they changed the system. So it was that sort of thing that was going on until ultimately you got to the big question, the welfare question that we're talking about, in which, among other things, I think the president liked the drama of it. Like that this was about hope. That this was, remember, what Burns was proposing, which was very good economics, was let's cut the budget. Let's worry about inflation and so forth. Well, that may be absolutely sound economics, but it ain't very exciting. And Nixon would like a little flair as well. I mean, he had plenty of flair on going to China and so forth on the foreign policy side, but I think Moynihan offered him flair. What was interesting is, quite honestly, Moynihan was a social scientist. He couldn't promise anything. He couldn't read the future more than anybody else. He could only say, I think if you do it this way, it's going to make a difference. And so the president proposed a welfare system in which he told the American people, hey, a conservative president says, this is going to cost you more. He actually says that. This is going to cost you more than the present system. So this was a huge leap into the future for Richard Nixon. And I don't think it would have happened. I can't imagine it would have happened had Daniel Patrick Moynihan not been there.
He also had, there's also other things that fell within the urban affairs portfolio. You named a few, including the DC Metro. Could you touch upon that a little bit?
Well, there were a lot of things. Washington at that time didn't have an elected government. In a funny way, we ran the government from our office. The mayor, I can remember once sitting in a fancy French restaurant, having lunch with the bureau chief of the New York Times, and a call comes in. That was a day when you didn't have cell phones. They bring a phone over to your desk. And it's my young assistant, Dick Blumenthal, who basically has the District of Columbia portfolio. And he says, the deputy mayor wants to know, should we buy the DC Transit? Should we buy the DC public-private transit system? I knew a little something about it because I had worked on that situation in Baltimore once. And I said, buy. By the way, I say that just to illustrate how big our portfolio was. I should also illustrate to show what a stupid statement I had just made. The right there was a right decision. It turned out right. That's not the question. The right answer that I should have given was, I'll be back in a half hour and we'll talk about it. But this is what happens in Washington because you're in a fancy restaurant with an important person and the phone is brought to you and you say, bye. Well, fortunately, it was the right decision.
Why does Pat Moynihan leave the White House?
Basically, his 2 years were up. He was going to go back to Harvard. Harvard meant a great deal to Moynihan. He did not come out of something of an elite legacy people. His father didn't go to Harvard and so forth. To become a professor at Harvard was quite an achievement for this poor boy from Hell's Kitchen in New York. And so he was planning to go back. It was not, and he was going to go back. His 2 years were going to be up. It was not that simple, but this gets into a much more complex story because my book actually covers both years, 69 and 70. If it had stopped in 1969 with the president giving his speech and the creation of the family proposal, Moynihan would have take a victory lap and go home. But in 1970, everything collapsed. We had Cambodia, we had Kent State, we had the leak of Nixon's memo on benign neglect. We had the defeat in the Senate Finance Committee of the Family Assistance Plan. And Pat was unhappy and said he wanted to go back to Harvard. Nixon said, I understand. Stay through the summer to help me get the Family Assistance Plan through Congress and then go back. So he was going to go back, and it was not. He had serious questions. He believed that Nixon wanted to end the war, and as long as Nixon wanted to end the war, he was the strategist. Moynihan wasn't the strategist, and it wasn't as if Moynihan was a dove just for peace. He wanted the war to be over. What happened after Cambodia and the not riots, but the mass meetings and Kent State with the killings of some students, Pat was very upset with how people in the administration responded to that, what they called the students, what Spiro Agnew called the students, what others called the students. These were our kids. They weren't gangsters or anything like that. They were protesting honorably. And Pat was very upset about that, and he wanted some response from the administration. to this sort of language and whatnot. So he was very upset by that. So that all entered into why he ultimately left. He left, though, with great respect for the president, and his letter of resignation is not a condemning letter in any way.